Canada, OWIT Kenya, and OWIT Zimbabwe. As a trade promotion organization supporting, let me try to invite Nadia to welcome us all before I go to the details of my remarks and presentation. Nadia, over to you.
Thank you, Najat. I think people are still joining, so maybe I'll just give a minute.
You can go ahead, Nadia.
Okay, great. Well, welcome to this webinar on women in the AfCFTA. We are very pleased to do this in partnership with CAWI, with OWIT, and with TFO Canada. And it's part of a larger initiative of the African Trade Policy Center at the Economic Commission for Africa on understanding how women can benefit from the AfCFTA, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which comes into effect next year. We've had a couple webinars already in English and in French on this topic, and so we're pleased that this is part of our series and that we're doing this jointly with the women's business associations here. Our broader portfolio on gender and the AfCFTA works towards our outcome of inclusive, increased intra-African trade. And we're working, as you'll hear in this session, on mainstreaming gender in implementation strategies at the national level and at the regional level for the Free Trade Area Agreement. And this is part of the capacity building portion of the work we're doing to understand the benefits of the agreement and to understand how to advocate at the national level for inclusive policies as the agreement is being implemented. We're also working on knowledge generation and transfer on understanding better how women can benefit and how the AfCFTA can support gender equality and women's economic empowerment. So without taking too much time, I'll pass it on. Thank you, Nagas, and welcome everyone again to this webinar, and we hope that you'll join us for future webinars. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadia, for the welcoming remark. I will provide my introductory remarks. Again, thank you all, our speakers, and also the participants that are here now joining us. Our center, the Center for Accelerated Women's Economic Empowerment, CAWI, is providing different support services to our women in export, where we are mainly focusing in 5 different sectors. We have agribusiness, where we have our members in coffee, green ground and roasted coffee. We also have women in honey, food, spices, flowers and vegetables in agribusiness. The second sector, we have textiles, garment and hand weaving. The third one, we have leather. And the fourth one, we have gemstones and jewelry. And the fifth one, we have services, tourism, hospitality, beauty, consultancy, etc., being part of that. Beyond providing the basic institutional support services, we are also involved in organizing policy dialogue forums and conducting action-oriented research, where we just finalized our research on strengthening women-to-women business linkage, lessons from experience. We will be organizing our research dissemination event in November 25, 2020, in partnership with the UNECA Knowledge Management Services team. You're all invited and we'll be glad to send you the meeting link. Coming back to our today's webinar, which the team Nadia mentioned, women in AfCFTA, how women entrepreneurs and traders can leverage the benefits of this agreement. We will be having 4 speakers in this session, where the detailed bios of the speakers is posted on our website. Hope you had a chance to see that and know whom is going to speak to you. And our question and answer session will be moderated by our sister Chingi from OWIT Zimbabwe. So this will be my brief introductory remark and introducing a bit of our speakers. Going straight to my presentation, because after my remarks, my presentation briefly will follow. I'll try to highlight some of the points of gender-related trade barriers confronting our members within CAWE. Members of CAWE, same like other women in business, they are as well facing different challenges when they are running their businesses. The hurdles faced by women who have embraced entrepreneurship are vast and often very different from those experienced by their male counterparts. One of it can be mentioned as defying confronting social expectations. As we all know, most female business owners who have attended networking events can relate to this scenario. You walk into a crowd seminar and can count the number of women there. You don't usually see supportive environment encouraging women to be part of networks, different platforms in the usual boys and the men's.
Excuse me, Nigest, you're on mute. Excuse me.
Oh, I've been talking all unmuted?
Just the last 1 minute.
Oh, okay. So I was trying to mention the major challenges that women face in business. And I was talking about defying, confronting social expectations. Most female business owners who have attended networking events can relate to this scenario. You walk into a crowded seminar and can count the number of women there. You don't usually see supportive environment encouraging women to be part of networks, different platforms in the usual boys and men's clubs. A robust support network is essential for entrepreneurial success, which women mostly lack. But still, overcoming such hurdles, some women in business that have confidence in who they are, we have seen outstanding women that have managed crossing that. The other challenge is limited funding, where all our women in the continent and beyond are challenged always. The inability to obtain capital is the biggest entrepreneurial challenge, particularly in accessing loans from formal banks. Always requesting for collateral, where in most cases, resources are registered under men's or husbands' names. So this had become a serious problem, I think, to most of our countries, including ours. In Ethiopia, we didn't wait for the government to respond to that. 11 of us who had been determined to work on that through a very challenging and difficult journey, we were able to establish the Ethiopian Women's Commercial Bank, the 16th private bank operating in the country, which we are really proud of leaving a legacy. And we have established a risk fund where we can provide a loan without collateral, the business being viable for quite a good number of women. This bank has also started attracting different partners like the DFC, the Development Finance Corporation of the US, where we received about 10 million USD guarantee fund, and the women that can afford showing 50% collateral are using that. The other problem which our women face is lack of access to public procurement. In Ethiopia, the public procurement sector is male dominated. Expenditure of public procurement takes the largest share from the annual government budget, which is 64% of our annual budget and 14% of our GDP. Countries like Kenya have been lucky enough to take measures in this area. In 2012, they have come out with a regulation taking aside 30% for youth, women, and persons with disabilities to benefit from public procurement. So there is need for supportive policies, not only on procurement area, but conducive business environment in other areas as well to alleviate the challenges that women face in business. The other problem our women face is balance between family and work, mainly for those married women. Women often feel more conflicted between work and family life due to social and cultural norms, as well as their reproductive roles. So women entrepreneurs may need to learn to be comfortable delegating tasks, which in most of the cases they want to do everything. So that's again, unbalancing their time between family and work, and also asking for help when necessary, starting from the family up to everywhere where they need support. The other challenge I want to mention is lack of supply side capacities, particularly for our women in export. This is a very critical problem, mainly for international buyers and wholesalers who request bulk supplies. As seen from our experiences, women involved in the same sector do not join hands to agree to work on a joint supplies. So this is a critical issue that needs change. The other challenge which we saw particularly as a result of passing through this COVID-19 is that we have seen our women in business being slow to adjust change. Beyond the usual changes, particularly at this time of the pandemic, women are slow to adjust to such changes, adopting to the virtual way of doing business, being visible online, like taking part in such kinds of relevant webinars, virtual trade shows, etc. We also see challenges on lack of women role models and limited support among women in business, among each other. There is need for women role models that can help as references, showcases, willing to handhold others, especially in supporting and guiding potential and emerging women entrepreneurs. There are very weak practices among women in business to support each other, where this needs to change to involve more women in business. Our research, which I just mentioned, has really indicated this weak linkage and networking. Last but not least, I just want to mention also another serious challenge, which is lack of strong national and regional platforms to support women in business within the continent, as well as in our respective countries. I believe there is need for strong national and continental platforms for women in business to share experiences, to learn from one another, for our voices and the voices of women in business to be properly heard, to be able to challenge our respective governments, as well as our heads of states on any issues that concern women in business, like now the CFTA, which is now at our hand. For example, in Ethiopia, we're not still members of the WTO. We started our accession 16 years back. Any one of us have never been involved for our inputs and ideas, let alone being our institutional being involved in that. We have never had any opportunity to serve as trade negotiators. So I believe the CFTA, which we are having at hand, will give us opportunity so that we can contribute, women in business can contribute to agreements like those. Very briefly, this is going to be my brief presentation on gender-related trade barriers confronting our members, which all works also to all our women in business. I now have the opportunity inviting Caroline, which is the president of OWIT Kenya, to provide her introductory remark and also continue in briefly presenting her gender-related trade barriers ideas confronting her OWIT members. Caroline, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nigel. Thank you very much. This is Caroline Gavi. Kindly allow me to share my slides, Evans. Kindly allow me to share my slides. Thank you. So thank you very much for giving us this opportunity in OWIT Kenya. do my introductory remarks, and then I'll go to barriers to trade for women. So today is a very important day for OWIT Kenya. We commence a series of partner webinars after our conference on 24th of September, which we looked at opportunities presented by the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. We at OWIT would like to thank our partners, the Center for Accelerated Women Economic Empowerment, CAWI in Ethiopia, our neighbors in Ethiopia, the United Nations Commission of Africa, TFO Canada, OWIT Zimbabwe, OWIT Nigeria, and Africa Trade Policy Center. So we're excited to be involved in a series of webinars, and one of our pillars is actually strategic partnership, and this will enable us to achieve our goal to facilitate our members generate 60% of their revenue from exports. We are honored to be part of this webinar. Now I'll go straight now to basically just a bit about OWIT. OWIT is a global association for women in trade. In Africa, we're in Kenya, Nigeria, and Zimbabwe, all joined here. We have the 3 presidents for the 3 countries on this webinar, and honored to have them here, Blessing, Shengi, and myself. So we have other upcoming OWIT Africa chapters in Uganda, South Africa, and Ghana, and we are currently 21 OWIT chapters around the world, hosted by OWIT International in the United States. OWIT Nairobi / Kenya was established in Nairobi in April 2001. And we have one vision, which is very critical for us, which is empowering women to transform communities through global trade. And our mission is promoting the advancement of women in international trade. Now we have one audacious goal, which we always speak about, is that by 2030, we would like our members to generate 60% of their revenue from exports. And the reason that we are here today to speak about this very important subject of the barriers that prevent women to transact in international trade. So just going directly to my presentation, I have very few minutes. Gender-related trade barriers confronted by OWIT members. This is information which the OWIT members have given to us as we work with them to help them get into the international trade market. This was generated through focus group discussions and questionnaires that we administered. Some of them are specifically not gender related, but I always say when there is a barrier, it affects a woman more than a man. So some of the things I'd like to first talk about is where our women in OWIT exporting to, where our women in OWIT exporting to. 19% of our women are exporting to the United Kingdom. 19% other are not exporting. They're just within Kenya and planning to export. 17% are exporting to the United States. 10% to Uganda, 10% to Tanzania, China, Rwanda, and you can see the list there. This means that 81% of our women are actually exporting. They might be exporting in small quantities or in large quantities. So these are the women we spoke to, and this is the feedback that they gave to us. Some of the challenges they have. I have divided them into key topics, access to finance being one of them. And so one of the challenges that our women have is understanding trade finance tools. There are very many tools that are there for exports, letters of credit, and all those kinds of tools. So understanding those tools is one of our challenges that they came up with. High collateral demands by financial institutions. I think that Nigest already spoke about this, and this is one of the biggest challenges. We say that women have a problem accessing credit and capital, and this is one of the challenges that they came up with. Know-how of facts or specific trade finance products. In fact, at some point we were being asked, are the trade finance products available in this market? So even the know-how of these things, how do they work, how do they function, how we can access them, is one of the challenges that our women face. Inadequate financing of startups. As you're aware, women manage small businesses, and for them to be able to export, they require a lot of financing. And within our Kenyan market, our financial institutions do not finance small businesses or startups. So this is another big challenge. Rigid financial institutions, they have products they have come up with, but these products are created for bigger businesses, which are not suitable for women. Again, another challenge is that when a woman goes to borrow money, sometimes it is impossible to be able to get financing, because sometimes the financial institutions don't take our businesses seriously. I think Nigest has already spoken about that as well. And then high capital requirement for exports. For you to be able to export, you need to have a good capital base because the volume of trading is very high. So this is one of the things that our members pointed out as one of the challenges in exports. And then high interest rates. So when you get that loan, when you're able to get it, then the high interest rates are very difficult to be able to pay afterwards. On taxes, and this is on taxes, understanding the different tax regimes. So we have our members exporting, like I said, so understanding the different tax regimes because they differ in different locations and different places. So this is one of the challenges that our members face. Complex tax requirements from different countries. Every country has their own tax requirement. For you to be able to export in these countries, you need to understand some of the requirements that those countries have put in place. So this is another challenge that our women are facing. Then taxes are too high. And sometimes when you're costing, they might not cost for all the taxes, and hence maybe they're not able to make money as they do the exports. And then understanding the different country tariffs. That's another thing which I've also mentioned is a challenge in taxes. So there's a big challenge that we need to deal with in tax matters. Information, which is very critical. I think that I just already spoke about it. What are the challenges? There is lack of well-packaged trade information. So for example, we are good at avocados, but where is there information that I can be able to put my hands on to export my avocados to Kenya, into the United Kingdom, or into Ethiopia, or into Egypt? Where is that well-packaged information about avocado specific? So again, about sector-specific information is not available for our members to be able to export. Information is not well organized for use in exports. So we have information available, it's not well organized, it's all over the place. So part of the challenge we have also been given as a business association is to help women arrange this information so that it can be well enough for use. And then information is is not complicated. So the information is available, but it is a bit complicated. And the places to get this information is not well known. Where do I get information on avocado? Where do I get information on fashion and industry? Where do I get information on manufacturing and where I can take my manufacturing of goods and services? So this is some of the challenges about information. Other barriers, I then get these other barriers, too many licenses. I think this is very clear. And I think that's the reason that this trade agreement is very important for us in Africa. Then there are many regulations, and we are hoping that these regulations can be dealt with. One of the things we have been told is that to do away with 90% of non-tariff barriers. We hope that that works for us. And then currency fluctuations in terms, which brings forex losses, because when you're trading internationally, you're trading with hard currency, and fluctuations within our countries affect trade and how you also been able to hedge for your goods to be able to make a margin from your products or services. Numerous country-specific product requirements. Every country has their own product requirements. They have their own specifications on how they would like their goods. So again, conforming to these specifications, knowing them, understanding them, and being able to conform. In fact, one of our members told us that she took some goods to Brazil, and on reaching there, she was told they do not comply, and she had to get 2 containers back. These are some of the challenges that we are dealing with as we export, and then too much documentation required to do simple work, and that's why I think this needs to be dealt with. I know that Kentrade is doing something in Kenya, and the other regional bodies as well, to be able to help with the documentation required for trade. And then a lot of legal jargon on export documentation, we think, is another big barrier for trade. If you look at the trade information that is presented, there's a lot of legal jargon, a lot of information that you need to consume and you don't understand. And this is another barrier that we believe is very difficult for women. They don't have time, they're doing their family work and their business. And it's important for us as women to simplify this documentation to help women trade. Another barrier is lack of adequate trade linkages in different countries. At OIT, we think that, that this can be sorted when we, as women in Africa, come together as countries and work together to create those linkages. And organizations like the UN can also help in this. And then inability to fulfill big orders, because we know that women operate small businesses. So if you get an order, you're unable to, fulfill a big order that you have received. And then high freight charges, diminishing profits. This is another big challenge that we have. We have those charges, and sometimes even the freight might not be adequate, or it is not available for small people, for small business women to be able to use charges. We know that some of our women even are using suitcases to carry their goods to different markets because they can't afford the big companies to export for them and to carry their goods and as they export. And then inability to scale, another big problem. I think that Nigel talked about this. You have a business, but because of the responsibilities you have in nurturing and bringing up a family, you're unable to scale the business to a big business, and this is another big challenge. And then lack of adequate market research. As women, we always say what we love, we love, and we assume that the world will love our product. And when we export, we wonder why is the world not liking our product. So we say there is lack of adequate market research, and this is one of the things that we need to really speak about. And then last but not least, as I think Nigel also said, fear of starting the export journey. Like I said, 19% of our members are not exporting, but they're within OIT to help them export. So it is for us to be able to facilitate them to get into the export journey and help them export. I think that's the end of my presentation for now, and I stop for the next presenter. And I just back to you.
Yes, Caroline, thank you very much for the very well-structured presentation. Thank you so much. We'll continue with our next presenter, Nadira from the African Trade Policy Center of the UNECA. Will be providing us a highlight on the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Nadira is a gender and trade expert within the African Trade Policy Center with very rich experience in trade areas. So we hope to learn more when she's providing us some highlights on the agreement. Thank you, Nadira, over to you.
Thank you so much, Nigest, and thank you for those kind words of introduction. If I could just ask Evans, is he assisting me with the presentation? Ah, wonderful. Thank you, Nigest. Thank you, Caroline, TFO Canada, Mary. It's really my pleasure to join you today. As Nigest mentioned, my name is Nadira Bayat. I'm with the African Trade Policy Center at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. And I join you today to talk about this historic Pan-African imperative. And it was really enlightening and insightful to listen to Nigest and to listen to Caroline talking about the gender-specific barriers and trade-related obstacles that you confront, because my responsibility today is really to try and break down this agreement establishing the African Continental Free Trade Area, because ultimately it's an agreement that needs to be implemented. It's an agreement that has been drawn up at the continental level, but implementation will take part at the national level. Responsibility for implementation of all agreements, including the agreement establishing the AfCFTA, is the responsibility of African governments. That said, this does not mean that it's the responsibility of African governments alone. To ensure not just implementation of the AfCFTA agreement, but to ensure inclusive implementation, we need to have an ecosystem of partners. We need to have an ecosystem of partners that includes the private sector, that includes women's business organizations like yourselves, that includes grassroots organizations, informal cross-border trade organizations, development partners. It's this ecosystem of partners that reinforce each other and that makes inclusive AfCFTA possible. It makes it real. It translates what could be potentially aspirational provisions in the agreement into into tangible, lasting progress for women on the ground, for you. So my objective today really, we don't have enough time, but it's to provide you with a high-level overview. And I know there may be lots of questions, and I'm not going to get around to answering your questions in all of today's session. And I'm really fortunate to be joined by my colleague, Judith Amiso, who's also going to talk to you about national processes at the country level. But between the two of us, we're going to do our best within the limited time frames to respond to what the burning issues are. And for those issues that we are not able to get around to, it's an ongoing conversation. The start of trade under the AfCFTA starts on the 1st of January, 2021, and we will continue to dialogue and to continue to support you in championing inclusive AfCFTA implementation. So friends, colleagues, participants, our learning outcomes very quickly. I think, Evans, if you can just go back to the learning outcomes, but you've seen it already. It's on the flyer, so I'm not going to waste too much of time going through them all. And you've heard about the multiple barriers, and I'm going to focus my presentation on this gender-sensitive approach to the implementation of the AfCFTA, talk a little bit about the national strategy of gender mainstreaming in AfCFTA national strategies that helps to address some of the identified constraints that Nigest and Caroline spoke to, that you experience every day. And with that, we're going to see how we can promote equality of opportunities for women and entrepreneurs in the AfCFTA. So if we could go very quickly to the next slide. About the AfCFTA agreement. Now, I'm going to share my slides with you. So again, I'm not going to go through each point, but you can see that it's a framework agreement establishing the AfCFTA that was signed by 44 AU member states on the 21st of March, 2018, in parallel with the Kigali Declaration and the protocol to the treaty establishing the African Economic Community relating to the free movement of persons, right of residence, and right of establishment. And up until now, there are 54 of the 55 AU member states that have signed the AfCFTA agreement, and 30 countries have ratified the agreement. And the agreement officially came into force on 30th of May, 2019. Now, the scope is very large. It requires AU member states to progressively remove tariffs on intra-African trade, which makes it much easier for African countries to trade within the continent. And it creates a liberalized continental market for goods and services. Now, the AfCFTA agreement covers trade in goods and services. It covers investment, intellectual property, and competition policy, and other policy areas that include trade facilitation and services, also regulatory measures such as technical barriers to trade and sanitary standards. Next slide, please. Now, if you look at this, you look at these figures here, you're going to see that we're talking about the change in intra-African exports by main sectors. And the AfCFTA really holds strong potential. You're going to read about it, you're going to hear about it, about the potential to stimulate and diversify exports that have historically remained in primary commodities in African countries. And this is really going to help to reduce vulnerability to commodity price fluctuations and to create employment through a more sustainable export base. The AfCFTA, as I mentioned, it commits African countries to removing trade barriers on imports and these trade barriers that will reduce import costs and consumer prices. And then, of course, consumers like yourself get to benefit from being able to consume a much larger variety of African products in a single African market. The real income gains from the AfCFTA agreement are expected to be significant. Africa's industrial exports are forecast to benefit most from the AfCFTA, and this really helps to promote the long-standing industrialization goals of African countries. Now, I want us to look at this graph, and United Nations Economic Commission for Africa projects that the value of intra-African exports will increase between 15% of 50 billion and nearly 25% or 69.1 billion in 2040 relative to the baseline in place without the AfCFTA. And of course, intra-African exports are expected to increase the most for industrial products, with gains ranging from between 25% or 36.1 billion and almost 30% or 43.3 billion US dollars. And all African countries are expected to benefit from the increased value-added exports under this agreement. In fact, least developed countries on the continent are expected to have the largest boost to industrial exports. And this really highlights the fact that the AfCFTA offers a tool for boosting intra-African trade in a way that also contributes to diversity and to inclusivity. And I'm also going to be sharing some readings with you at the end through Nigest and to Caroline that will familiarize you with the exports, both industrial exports and agricultural exports that are projected to gain most under the AfCFTA. Now, if you look at the AfCFTA agreement, the architecture and key features, as I said, there's the framework agreement, and the AfCFTA agreement comprises 3 layers. There's the framework agreement that really defines in general terms the purposes and intentions of the AfCFTA. It establishes its primary definitions and outlines the scope. There's the protocol to the agreement that covers the various, there's protocol in trade in goods, there's the protocol in trade in services, the protocol in dispute settlement, protocol in intellectual property, protocol on competition policy, and protocol on investments. Now, you will see that the protocol in trade in goods and trade in services, the negotiations have concluded, but the protocol in intellectual property, competition policy, and investment negotiations are expected to conclude by June 2021. Now, at the core, at the heart of the protocol on trade in goods is Article 7. And in accordance with Article 7 of this protocol in trade in goods, state parties are required to progressively eliminate import duties or charges having equivalent effect on goods originating from the territory of one state party in accordance with schedules of tariff concessions. Now, the modalities, I'm not going to go into the detail, but it's about, this is what the agreement is about. It's about progressively eliminating import duties so African countries are able to trade with one another, to trade with each other instead of sending everything out of the continent. And the AfCFTA objectives and scope are very large, and it really is to create this liberalized one continental markets for goods and services, facilitated by the movement of persons. And the objective is to ensure stronger integration of African economies in support of the continent's development agenda. If we can just move to the next slide, please. Now, I'm not going to go into the details, you're going to get the presentation, but I would encourage you to look at the general and specific objectives of the AfCFTA agreement is set out in these articles. So you're going to receive that, I believe it's Article 3 and Article 4 that sets out the general and specific objectives of the AfCFTA. Next slide. And as I mentioned, already, AfCFTA negotiations are split into 3 phases. Phase 1 has concluded, and those are the protocols that cover trade in goods and trade in services and rules and procedures for the settlement of disputes. And we're going into phase 2 negotiations, protocols on investment, intellectual property rights, and competition policy to be concluded by June 2021. Also very interesting, in accordance with a decision adopted at the 33rd ordinary session of the Assembly of the Union, the negotiations on e-commerce will commence with an AfCFTA protocol on e-commerce expected to commence immediately after the conclusion of phase 2 negotiations. Next slide, please. I'm not going to get into the details on the institutional framework for implementing the AfCFTA agreement, but there is a particular institutional framework for implementing the agreement, starting with the African Union Assembly. And again, we have literature that breaks this down for you, that helps you to better understand it. And then you'll see we go down: Council of Ministers, Committee of Senior Trade Officials, Committee on Trade and Services, Dispute Settlement Body, Committee on Trade in Goods, and the various subcommittees that have to be formed, right down to the AfCFTA national committees where implementation is going to happen. Because again, it's a continental agreement, but implementation will take place at the country level. So we have the national committees and the regional committees. Now, the AfCFTA, as I said, it's not just any trade agreement. It is a tool for sustainable development. And that's what we need to understand. And that's what we need to hold our policymakers and our governments to account to. It's really established as one of the flagship projects of the African Union Agenda 2063, the Africa we want. And it seeks to progressively to liberalize trade and to accelerate the growth of intra-African trade that is fundamental, that is crucial, not just to development, but to sustainable and inclusive economic development, and to employment generation, and to the effective integration of the entire continent into the global economy. When fully implemented, the AfCFTA is going to span across 55 African countries. And this single market, this one market created under the AfCFTA agreement that connects approximately 1.27 billion consumers across 55 countries, with an aggregate GDP of between $2.1 and $3.4 trillion, is expected to bring considerable benefits to all African countries. By progressively eliminating tariffs, by removing the barriers on intra-African trade, the AfCFTA is really the fundamental objective of this, is to make it easier for African businesses to trade within the continent and to benefit from these big economies of scale through access to a population that's expected to grow from approximately 1.27 billion by 2020 to 2.75 billion by 2060, with more than 42% expected to be middle class. Now, this bigger market access to regional markets allows countries to benefit from a faster growth of exports. It boosts industrialization through diversified trade that's not just dependent on extractive commodities, on primary commodities like oils and minerals. We're looking at, through the CFTA, to moving to a more sustainable export-based. It also looks at and seeks to achieve increased levels of industrial production, which allows African countries to move up in value chains, with less industrialized countries also benefiting from integration into these value chains through the AfCFTA. Next slide, please. Now, the AfCFTA has the potential to increase and to accelerate the economic empowerment of women as a fundamental component of gender equality by expanding opportunities for women's employment. There was a recent World Bank study that has just been undertaken that shows that as a result of expansion of output in female-intensive industries and sectors that employ a larger share of women. I think we on the slide that says towards inclusive AfCFTA implementation. So the slide before, Evans. Before? Yes, that's the one. So yes, so this study shows that as a result of an expansion in female-intensive industries and sectors that employ a larger share of women, female wages will grow faster than male wages in approximately 19 African countries. But, and we're going to talk about this throughout the study and throughout our conversation, and Nigest and Caroline also alluded to that fact, these are upper bound estimates, which really highlight the need for complementary policy reforms that must support labor mobility and equality of opportunities, especially for female workers. We can see that effective and inclusive, meaningful AfCFTA implementation can also promote entrepreneurship and economic opportunities for women-owned businesses through increased access, through new regional export markets, and through expanded opportunities across key sectors. And of course, I spoke about businesses benefiting from economies of scale and access to a much larger population. Next slide, please. Now, women-owned businesses have the opportunity to expand to new markets under the AfCFTA and to increase their earnings, but there are multiple barriers that prevent women entrepreneurs from taking advantage of these opportunities in an integrated continental market. Now, Nigest and Caroline spoke so articulately about that and spoke so eloquently about these gender-specific constraints confronting women-owned barriers. And, you know, and I guess just started off by reminding us all that these are completely different to those experienced by our male counterparts. You know, just the fact of having to defy social expectations by being a female entrepreneur, that in itself is a barrier. So although we have the literature, we have the studies, we have the evidence-based analysis that tells us that women entrepreneurs and female traders are disproportionately affected by trade-related barriers, it's always so interesting to hear you know, from you directly as to what this is, because we're always reading about it, but just listening to Nigest, listening to Caroline, just encapsulated so succinctly was incredibly important. And I'm not going to go through all of those barriers again, but of course they are there, and they, you know, just highlight the importance of proper policies, gender responsive policies, targeted complementary measures, and programs to be able to address these barriers. And of course, Caroline spoke to lack of access to finance, lack of trade-related information, trade documentation, lack of adequate trade linkages. All of these are considerable barriers. So when, you know, we read about, we hear about these non-tariff measures that are more burdensome for women-owned exporting businesses, that make it costly for firms to export and to import, but they also, they're those barriers, but they're also beyond the border constraints that are equally important and explain how these limitations that confront women can reduce women's access to trade-related employment and services. And of course, Nigest and Caroline spoke to limited access to finance, to social and cultural norms, to limited, to legal discrimination, to education, to skills gaps, to confidence, to lack of access to mentors and platforms for women's networking, women's lack of confidence and risk preferences, and of course, access, household responsibilities, time constraints, and care. So, you know, when you think of the AfCFTA agreement and you read the agreement and you think, well, what does that have to do with women's time constraints and care? Well, everything, because if those are not adequately addressed, women are not going to be able to leverage these provisions and to be able to harness and to exploit the tremendous potential inherent in the AfCFTA agreement. Now, we move on to what the agreement itself says about gender-related considerations, because I spoke very briefly and you're going to read further about the agreement, about what it promises, what these studies say about effective implementation and all the benefits that accompany effective implementation. But how do we translate that? How do we translate the aspirational, the potential into something meaningful? Well, what does this mean to you as women entrepreneurs? Well, let's start first with the agreement. What does it say on gender equality considerations? The fact of the matter, it doesn't say very much. Certainly when you compare it to some of the instruments at the REC level, if you look at COMESA, you look at the EAC, you look at the SADC protocol, you know, these are instruments that have dedicated chapters on socioeconomic development and advancing women's economic empowerment. The AfCFTA agreement does not have that. It does not have a specific chapter dedicated to gender and trade, nor does it place obligations on member states to advance women's economic empowerment and to facilitate trade for women entrepreneurs. The preamble of the agreement contains explicit reference to the importance of gender equality for the development of international trade and economic cooperation. Article 3E emphasizes the need to promote and to attain sustainable and inclusive socioeconomic development, gender equality, and structural transformation of state parties as one of the general objectives of the AfCFTA. But if you look at that, that in itself does give you an indication of the intention and the spirit behind the drafting, because there is a recognition here of the link between inclusive socioeconomic development and gender equality and the structural transformation of state parties. And inherent is a recognition of the fact that socioeconomic development on the continent is impossible without gender equality. We need gender inclusive growth to be able to achieve inclusive socioeconomic development. We can't have one without the other. Gender inequalities will not result in inclusive socioeconomic development as one of the objectives of, as the main objective of the AfCFTA agreement, as the main objective of the objectives of our countries, of our national development priorities, the commitments that we developed and that we meant to adhere to at the regional level, at the global level. So we need gender inclusive growth as the foundation for sustainable development. And then another critical article is Article 27.2D of the AfCFTA Protocol on Trade in Services that we're going to be talking a little bit more about later, that refers to improving the export capacity of formal and informal service suppliers with particular attention to micro, small, and medium-sized operators and women and youth service suppliers. So next slide, please. Evans, next slide. Okay, great. Now, so as I said, there are not as many provisions, and I think, you know, I often speak to colleagues and friends, and then it's a bit, people are a bit disappointed. The AfCFTA agreement has not been as extensive. It hasn't gone as far as it should go in terms of advancing gender equality objectives and women's economic empowerment goals, in terms of placing a responsibility on state parties to facilitate these opportunities for women in trade, particularly since women are disproportionately disadvantaged by trade-related barriers. So that's true, it doesn't have that, but what are we going to do about that? And you know, now it's time to be creative, and now it's time for us to think out of the box. And the beauty about the AfCFTA is that it gives us this opportunity to do that. It gives us this opportunity to really be creative, to think of bold, new, innovative approaches for all of us to come together as part of this ecosystem of partners that I told you about, and that we're going to talk about, and that you're going to see coming alive, because African governments may have the sole responsibility to implement the agreement, but they're not going to be able to do it alone. They need an ecosystem of partners that includes you, not just through your business associations, but includes you as citizens, as equal custodians of the AfCFTA agreement to make it work. So together, we are going to find and we are going to create these practical, tangible, concrete solutions that's going to make trade in the area of the AfCFTA business unusual. So there are a number of provisions in the agreement that are not gender specific, but are of consequence, that mean something special to you in your different roles as women small-scale traders, as informal cross-border traders, as entrepreneurs, as producers, and as workers. And these provisions can be leveraged to empower and to advance new trade and economic opportunities generated by the agreement that we're talking about for you in your various economic roles. Now, the AfCFTA is grounded in trade facilitation, and trade facilitation measures, as you know, can make it easier for women to trade, and they simplify and they harmonize and they automate import and export procedures to reduce the costs that businesses face in complying with trade requirements. And trade facilitation can include modernizing border procedures. It can include improving transparency and predictability, eliminating procedural inefficiencies, while ensuring that trade complies with legitimate public policy objectives. So we're going to look at how we can leverage provisions in the AfCFTA agreement to empower women's economic, to advance women's economic empowerment. Now, if you look at the customs cooperation, trade facilitation, and transit provisions, now you're going to look again, and I want you to reflect when I go through the provisions in the AfCFTA agreement. I don't want you to think of them as boring trade agreement provisions and what do they have to do with me, and you know, it's a trade agreement, it's complicated. It's not. You're going to apply the provisions that I'm going to talk to you about, and you're going to apply them to the challenges that Nigest and Caroline outlined, and you're going to apply them to your own challenges that you experience. And at the end, we are going to together think through some of these innovative and bold and creative practical solutions in the era of the AfCFTA that's going to make trade business unusual for women, particularly. Now, customs cooperation, trade facilitation, and transit provisions, how can they help you? Well, women entrepreneurs and informal small-scale and cross-border traders tend to be disproportionately affected by regulatory and procedural barriers that include customs cooperation, border documentation requirements, rules of origin requirements, and other technical regulations and procedures at the border. And there are extensive provisions in the AfCFTA agreement in the annexes that speak specifically to facilitating trade through customs cooperation, trade facilitation, and transit provisions. Next slide, please. Now this is particularly important. This AfCFTA online portal for non-tariff barrier monitoring, reporting, and elimination, created under Annex 5 of the Protocol on Trade in Goods. Now, why is this so important? Well, it's so important because you know better than me that women are disproportionately affected by non-tariff barriers. So this innovative mechanism, this tool that you can get more information on at tradebarriers.africa, that acts as the platform and operates as the NTB reporting mechanism tool, is particularly important because it's going to support efforts to make continental trade easier and less costly by helping African businesses report these barriers and support their elimination with the help of governments. It's going to make it possible for African businesses like yourselves to play an active role in removing these obstacles to continental trade by reporting these NTBs and having them resolved through this mechanism outlined in the Protocol on Trade in Goods and Services, Annex 5 on NTBs. So you see how we're making this come alive. You see, this is different, it's innovative, it's new, and it's something that you need to be aware of, particularly as women entrepreneurs. You need to promote sensitization and to raise awareness of the tradebarriers.africa platform among African MSMEs and to encourage your businesses to use this platform, which will really make trading across the continent much easier. Now, the ECA estimates that the AfCFTA has the potential to boost intra-African trade by 52.3% by eliminating import duties that we spoke about, but this could double if non-tariff barriers were also reduced. So again, I encourage you to become familiar with this non-tariff barrier mechanism because it's a tool that's going to facilitate trade. And these trade-related complaints will be reported and should be monitored by African governments in each country and by a dedicated NTB coordination unit at the AfCFTA Secretariat. And the NTB coordination unit is responsible for verifying these complaints. And once these complaints are verified, officials in the country concerned are tasked with addressing the issue in accordance with timelines prescribed by the AfCFTA agreement. We go to the next one and we look at technical barriers to trade and sanitary and phytosanitary measures. And we know that women face acute complications and difficulties when it comes to costs of complying with technical or sanitary standards, obtaining certificates of origin and other trade documentation to expedite the movement of goods across borders. And women struggle to comply with trade-related SPS measures, often because they lack critical skills or they have greater difficulties in accessing the required resources. By covering so these technical barriers to trade and SPS measures really make it easier for small-scale traders and smallholder farmers to meet export standards and to satisfy regulatory requirements and to address trade obstacles that remain particularly burdensome for women entrepreneurs. And in that way, it helps not just women entrepreneurs, it helps small-scale traders and smallholder farmers, the majority of whom are women, to meet export standards and to satisfy regulatory requirements. And of course, because women are confronted disproportionately by these challenges, these provisions can help to address these trade obstacles that remain particularly burdensome for women in their various roles as entrepreneurs, as producers and traders. Now, we're going to go quickly to the technical assistance and capacity building and training provisions. Now, these provisions are very important, and we're going to talk a little bit more about them. Actually, when in listening to Nigest and Caroline outlining the gender-specific barriers, you will also be able to apply these provisions and to the constraints that you currently confront, and to be able to respond to the questions, how would you articulate, how would you clarify and explain what your technical assistant needs are, what your capacity building and training requirements are? Because these provisions can really help to improve the export capacity and to build the technical expertise and skills and trading capacity of women-owned businesses, empowering you to take advantage of these new export opportunities that arise from AfCFTA implementation. And technical training and capacity building for trade participation could further assist small-scale female entrepreneurs to formalize their businesses, to become small and medium export businesses. And these provisions can be used to support women who may be disproportionately impacted by gender-specific trade barriers to take advantage of new trade opportunities in AfCFTA implementation. And of course, you define them, and in defining them, they will help to build your technical expertise and your trading capacity. And as I said, to be able to take advantage of these new opportunities. So we have spoken about Article 27(2)(D) of the Protocol on Trade in Goods and Services that requires state parties, where possible, to mobilize resources in collaboration with development partners to implement measures in support of domestic efforts of state parties with a view to improving the export capacity of women-owned businesses. So again, you know, there is this provision in the AfCFTA agreement. It does not say that it is targeted, well, this one does say to assist women-owned businesses and micro, small and medium-sized women and youth service suppliers, but there are also other technical assistance and capacity building provisions in the AfCFTA agreement that used creatively, applied creatively, can respond to the needs that you have articulated and can help you to take advantage of export opportunities, of business opportunities and economic opportunities in general that have been created through AfCFTA implementation. Now, I want to talk very quickly about simplified trade regimes. We know that informal cross-border trade provides a substantial livelihood and is among the major activities for self-employed women in the informal sector, with women constituting up to 60 to 70% of cross-border traders in some African countries. But again, women confront disproportionately higher barriers that prevent them from leveraging the full potential of cross-border trade. And there are a number of gender-based challenges that women confront that men do not confront. And these include bribery and corruption, harassment, sexual violence on some occasions, limited access to finance, misinformation about customs procedures and regulations, and confiscations of goods at the border. And some of you know these gender-specific constraints that confront female cross-border traders better than I do. So how, again, do we use provisions in the AfCFTA agreement to be able to support this critical group of women who make a substantial contribution to trade in African countries? Now, the ability of female cross-border traders and small-scale traders to harness and to leverage the opportunities of the AfCFTA is again dependent on the ability to address the gender-specific challenges confronted by these traders. And trade facilitation measures, for example, through the introduction of a continental simplified trade regime, could help to address some of the gender differentiated, the different barriers, trade barriers, and to extend the benefits of the AfCFTA to small scale and informal cross-border traders. So state parties will need to give further consideration to the establishment of a continental simplified trade regime. Now, when we talk about the AfCFTA, and the Continental Simplified Trade Regime, but that goes for many other initiatives and interventions. We're not looking at starting from scratch again. And particularly for Simplified Trade Regime, we are talking about initiatives that have, sorry, Evans, is the PowerPoint back up again? I don't think I see it. Okay, that's fine. I'm going to continue talking to the PowerPoint presentation, and you will have the slides and you can follow it with my narrative. But we're really going to talk about a simplified trade regime here that has been initiated and is being led by COMESA and at the EAC levels, where informal cross-border traders are provided by certificates of origin with a common list of goods that qualifies for simplified trade regimes, that are assisted with simplified customs documents and assisted in completing clearance procedures and in answering trade-related queries. So you can see, as part of looking at a continental simplified trade regime, we also have to see at what worked at the REX levels. What can we build on? What can we learn from? There's the recommendation that the list of goods covered under a continental simplified trade regime be extended beyond a COMESA simplified trade regime list, which covers a relatively small number of products. The fact that a continental simplified trade regime could be further strengthened through communication and information on AfCFTA policy and customs requirements and procedures, so to better support small-scale traders. So again, so many opportunities for us to learn from best practice, to scale up interventions that have worked at the REC level, and for us to do things differently in the AfCFTA. There's also the possibility of a gender-responsive trade facilitation agenda that creates predictable and efficient customs processes, reduces the clearance times for trade costs, and increases the involvement of women in trade facilitation mechanisms, and really acts as this catalyst for trade. And again, there's nothing new. There've been a number of trade facilitation programs that have been implemented at the regional level, at the country level. So what are these trade facilitation programs that have worked? How can we leverage provisions of the AfCFTA agreement to build a gender-responsive trade facilitation agreement, trade facilitation agenda in the era of the AfCFTA? So again, this is not a conversation that governments should be having alone. This is a conversation that they should be having with you, because you know better than anyone else what has worked, what hasn't worked, and it's your intelligence, it's your insight that needs to inform this new agenda going forward, that needs to inform new policies under the AfCFTA. Now, Again, we need a targeted approach to AfCFTA implementation, because I mentioned that it's a continental agreement that needs to take place at the national level. The AfCFTA provides so many opportunities for economic development on the continent, but there should not be an assumption on the 1st of January that the trade gains, when the start of trade begins, that it's going to make a considerable difference, or you're going to wake up in the morning and things are going to be different for your business. They're not going to be. So don't assume that. You should not assume that the trade gains arising from AfCFTA implementation will be equitably distributed, nor should you assume that AfCFTA implementation will automatically translate into higher levels of employment. AfCFTA state parties, your governments, need to adopt a targeted approach to ensure the translation of these opportunities into concrete socioeconomic benefits while preparing for potential risks that might occur. So what do we do now? How do we have these provisions? How do we have the fact that it's not going to be automatic, but still ensure that it translates into opportunities for you? Well, then we need to be looking at a different approach, a gender-sensitive approach to AfCFTA implementation. And we're going to talk a little bit about how AfCFTA state parties, supported by you, can advance a gender-sensitive approach to AfCFTA implementation. Now, a gender-sensitive approach to AfCFTA implementation is going to happen at the national level. And through the national level, AfCFTA state parties are in the midst of devising and developing AfCFTA national strategies to implement the AfCFTA agreement. Now, these may be national strategies, they may be roadmaps, they may be plans, but there needs to be a way of translating the agreement into domestic and realities. And this can only be done through a national strategy that's also contextualized, because our country realities differ. So you need to have a national strategy that is going to translate these provisions in the AfCFTA agreement into something concrete. And the process of doing that at the national level is through a process of gender mainstreaming. Now, I think my colleague Judith will talk a little bit more about AfCFTA national strategies, but the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, together with the African Union Commission, has been supporting African countries from last year and continues to do so this year in devising these national strategies to implement the AfCFTA agreement. And the process of translating these provisions on or gender equality considerations in the AfCFTA agreement, the process of translating the other provisions that are not gender specific, but could still advance economic empowerment opportunities and advance gender equality objectives for women is through AfCFTA national strategies, and particularly through this process of gender mainstreaming. Now, we will also be sharing literature with you on that, and we hope next year, as part of our capacity building programs, we'll be able to roll out more targeted training on gender mainstreaming as we've started to do. But very quickly, the overall objective is to understand how women contribute and participate in trade in their various roles as workers, as small-scale traders and entrepreneurs, to examine the gender dimension and impact of issues, specifically as they relate to production and trade, to AfCFTA market opportunities and export performance, to look at AfCFTA-related risks and gender-specific constraints for women, and as we all know, who are tend to be disproportionately affected by trade barriers and inequalities, with the view to ultimately identifying complementary measures that can address trade obstacles for women in order for women to be able to leverage these new opportunities in the AfCFTA. I see that I've lost my presentation again, so I'm just going to continue talking through, and you will find it at the end of the webinar. But really, colleagues, friends, we have seen now through COVID, just the complete devastation that it's wreaked in our countries, in our economies, and on our personal lives. And COVID-19 is going to impact, it has impacted, it will continue to impact the most vulnerable and marginalized, amongst which women are disproportionately represented the hardest. And we've also seen, we also heard, and most importantly, you also know that taking advantage of trade opportunities, including, we've been told by literature, and particularly the recent World Bank study, but the fact that Nigest and Caroline spoke to it. It brought to light exactly what they're saying, because that study says that taking advantage of trade opportunities, including trade and services, digital trade and value chains, depends on more than trade policies. And that's exactly what we heard from Nigest and from Caroline in the context of the AfCFTA, taking advantage of regional value chains, of e-commerce opportunities, of trade in services. Everything that the AfCFTA promises depends so much more than just trade policies. So gender responsive complementary measures and policies and targeted interventions and programs, a trade facilitation agenda that really improves women's access to digital technology, to trade related information, to gender sensitive infrastructure, to access to finance, to skills development, to training. All of this that's so critical to enhancing women's capacity to be able to leverage new trade and economic opportunities under the AfCFTA, because it's not going to happen by just trade policies. I mean, we've seen that, you know that. So the question is, how do we contribute? How do we add our voices to inform our governments that simply when the AfCFTA is implemented, in order to be able to support us, this is what we want. This, when we talk about gender responsive AfCFTA policies, particularly in the aftermath of COVID-19 and the devastation that it has and that it's wrought in our countries, in our personal lives, in our economies, this is what we need. Because actually, colleagues, as I said, responsibility, and I keep saying this, for implementation of the agreement lies with state parties, but we all have a critical stake in supporting this meaningful and inclusive AfCFTA implementation. So I'm going to conclude on the last slide and then hand over to my colleague Judith. You don't see the last slide, but basically what I was saying is, women play a key role in trade and will be essential to advancing effective and inclusive AfCFTA implementation. So your voice as women's business associations, as civil society, as private sector actors, play a critical role in defining your capacity building, your technical assistance, your training needs to be able to support yourselves, to be able to support each other, to harness these opportunities. And these needs need to be defined. I now have the pleasure to hand over to my colleague Judith Ameso, trade policy expert at UNECA, who will talk about national AfCFTA policy processes and the potential for you to be involved at the national level in supporting inclusive, effective, and gender-sensitive AfCFTA implementation. Thank you, friends, for your time, and I look forward to continuing this conversation and to working closely with you in championing this business unusual approach. Thank you. Judith, over to you.
Thank you, Nadira. I'm just trying to share my screen. Just a second. Can you see my screen?
Yes, Judith, we can see it.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Nadira. I think you've done an excellent job of giving a high-level overview of the AfCFTA Agreement and the envisaged benefits for African businesses, including including women-owned businesses. The AfCFTA agreement, as you rightly put it, recognizes the importance of inclusion, in particular gender equality, as one of the general objectives of the agreement. And specifically, it says to promote and attain sustainable and inclusive socioeconomic development, gender equality, and socioeconomic transformation of state parties. Nadira has also mentioned a little bit of the work that we are doing on the AfCFTA strategies, and this is where my presentation is going to be focused. And also in developing the AfCFTA strategies, the importance of gender is captured through evaluation of the gender dimension, analysis of female participation in economic activities, which Nadira has spoken a little bit about, identification of critical sectors for women, which is required to determine how the AfCFTA can advance gender equality and women's economic empowerment, identifications of gender-specific outcomes, identification of a gender-specific goal, activities and targets, as well as use of gender disaggregated data in monitoring and evaluation, in monitoring the implementation of the agreement. So my presentation will focus on the process of developing the AfCFTA strategies as well as implementation activities in order to highlight some of the entry points for engaging with or leveraging national policy processes. But before that, if you take a look at this slide, this is just a snapshot of what a typical trade policy making process in a country is. You have terms of reference for developing that trade policy. You'll have consultations, which will lead into a draft. You'll have a technical review, and then finalization, which will eventually lead to submission of that draft to cabinet. The process of developing the AfCFTA strategies more or less follows along a similar line, and we will get into this a little bit later on. So in order to develop national AfCFTA strategies, in order for them to be effective, we use an approach, we approach the process of developing them in two ways. This is right from the design to the implementation, as well as monitoring and evaluation. We also employ a very consultative process, which is critical, considering the multidimensional and cross-cutting nature of the AfCFTA agreement. So the first approach we use is an integrated approach, which really implies coherence between the AfCFTA strategies and other cultural policy, education, other social policies that advance our country's development agenda. The second approach is a participatory approach, which really relies on the strong national technical team, which is composed of public and private sector entities, academia, civil society, gender, women and youth groups and associations. And this is important in bringing the relevant stakeholders together. The participatory approach also ensures that mechanisms for participation must promote the implementation of proactive measures such that women, who are a particularly disadvantaged group, as we have heard from other previous speakers, are able to make their voices heard in the national AfCFTA strategies. The effective and meaningful participation of African entrepreneurs, traders and activists, as well as civil society, is critical, and in order to address any potentially adverse outcomes of the agreement and to promote positive effects on gender equality. The ultimate result of this approach is that there should be consensus around the key components of the AfCFTA national strategies, as well as buy-in from all stakeholders, which once again, I would stress includes female, women-owned businesses or women stakeholders. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this is a flow of how the process that we use to develop national AfCFTA strategies. And this really is where the opportunities lie for women and gender groups to be able to input or gain entry points into the national policy processes. Typically, we will ECA will receive a request from a country to support the development of a national AfCFTA strategy. And then this will be followed by inception discussions. With before COVID, this meant that we'd have a team of experts from the Economic Commission for Africa, from the African Union Commission, to go and meet with various stakeholders on the ground to really discuss what the scope of the request is. Once it's been agreed on what the scope is, then we'll have national consultations and national forum, part of which is used as sensitization, because one of the things that that countries have expressed is a lack of knowledge or sensitization around issues related to the AfCFTA. Now, consultations, they can take a form of a forum or a conference or a workshop, but also we use bilateral or targeted engagement with specific stakeholders in different sectors. And I'm happy to note that Shengi here, when we were doing the national strategy for Zimbabwe, she was a part of that process, and we had some very interesting discussions on the role and inputs for women in Zimbabwe. So following the national consultations, there will be a period of drafting, which will mostly be handled by the technical team. And then thereafter, there'll be a technical review. Again, this is something that is done between the team at ECA, the AUC, a couple of other partners that we work with, but also importantly, the national stakeholders. And I probably have to mention at this point that the key institution that we engage with in this process is the Ministry of Trade or the Ministry of Commerce. They are the focal points who take a hold of the process and lead the process of developing the AfCFTA strategies. Then finally is the national validation of the AfCFTA strategy, which really is the last look at the strategy before it's prepared for finalization and submission to the ministry. Now, the previous slide just talks about the entry points in the process of developing the strategy, but beyond that, there are also other opportunities in implementation of the strategy. So in terms of the implementation, opportunities exist in a couple of ways. One is development of sectoral policies. Once the strategy has been developed, we've also received requests for support in developing of sectoral strategies. And this is where you can really see the importance of involving different sectors and different stakeholders in the process. Some of the implementation requests that we have for implementation are on issues such as capacity building, whether it is for women groups or youth group, private. In Sierra Leone, for example, we are currently supporting to review and develop national industrial policy and the special economic zones policy as some of the identified activities from the strategy. And Kawi and OWIT and other women's groups can they organize themselves to engage with the consultative process that will lead to the development of these sectoral strategies. In terms of training and capacity building still, there are trainings on different range of topics, whether it's sensitization about the agreement itself or on technical issues that would benefit traders or help them to understand a little bit more about the agreement. And this is on issues such as non-tariff barriers that Nadira has alluded to, rules of origin, customs procedures and the like. So currently in this year, in terms of capacity building and training, ECA has so far organized one online training session for women and gender groups, which was held on the platform on the EDEP platform. In terms of the AfCFTA committees, we're currently supporting Cameroon, which has already developed its national AfCFTA strategies, but has requested for support in training and capacity building for both the private and public sector, with the expectation that the result of this will be the establishment of the AfCFTA committee. Finally, private sector, there are the support that has been given to various private sector institutions, such as the Pan-African Chamber of Commerce, the East African Chamber of Commerce, as well as other chambers of commerce in different regions across Africa, still on issues to do with capacity building and training around the AfCFTA. Finally, is also on the review of national policies, laws, and regulations in support of domestication of the agreement. In Nigeria, for example, they are planning to undertake an audit and analysis of all the relevant laws, and this will culminate into a study which will inform the bill for domesticating the AfCFTA in Nigeria. Once again, this is an example of how CAWE and OWIT members and gender groups can participate in national policy, trade policy making processes. Now, another entry point for the inputting into national policy processes is the AfCFTA national implementation committees. In some the AfCFTA agreement itself explicitly requires implementation through regional or national committees. The AU committed to establish national committees or AfCFTA to ensure meaningful national AfCFTA and boosting in intra-African trade strategy. There's Article 8 on the National Committee on Trade Facilitation, where it states or requires state parties to establish or maintain a national committee on trade facilitation, or designate an existing mechanism to facilitate both domestic coordination and implementation of the provisions of the annex. We also have other examples in Annex 5 on non-tariff barriers, which provides that state parties shall establish national monitoring committees and national focal points on NTBs. Now, I want to highlight this because in some countries, and well, generally, it is recognized that it might not be effective to establish or to create multiple committees that are working on trade issues. And so if there is a national NTBs committee or a national trade facilitation committee, these are also examples of institutional frameworks that women and gender groups can be a part of in terms of leveraging national processes for trade policy making. So in practice, therefore, the effective implementation is more likely if countries can create AfCFTA committees or institutions that are composed of stakeholders who are focused on satisfying the commitments and interests of the AfCFTA, but also harmonizing the country's approach to implementation. As I said, for countries that already have a national trade committee or a national trade facilitation committee, there might be no need to develop a new structure or a new committee. It would be sufficient for them to only expand their mandate to account for the AfCFTA related issues. And countries have taken a different approach to how they want to establish national AfCFTA committees. In Zambia and Zimbabwe, for example, these are examples of countries that have already developed and validated their AfCFTA strategies. So the idea there was to revamp the existing committees and provide a new set of terms of reference and have them handle the AfCFTA related work. In Nigeria, this is a typical example of a country that it is yet to ratify the agreement, but they already have a National Action Committee on the AfCFTA, which has actually already begun working on implementing the agreement, as well as gathering views from stakeholders, say, for the development of the AfCFTA strategies. Another example is in Cameroon, where although they have also developed and validated a national AfCFTA strategy, and although they don't have a committee, what they have requested is for a training for both public and private sector stakeholders. And then the result of that will inform the establishment of the AfCFTA committee. Now, just to give an idea of what the work of the AfCFTA committee is, the overarching mandate is to ensure proper coordination of AfCFTA implementation through the national strategy. More specifically, some of the functions include putting the AfCFTA agreement into national context through domestication of the provisions, playing a role in interface between the country, the regional economic communities, and the AfCFTA Secretariat, leading the negotiations process, coordinating development of national and sectoral strategies within the AfCFTA context, undertaking sectoral policy analysis and making appropriate recommendations to the government, ensuring effective implementation of the AfCFTA related measures as agreed by the government, and mainstreaming gender, youth, and other issues such as environment, e-commerce in the implementation of the AfCFTA agreement. Now, this slide here, I hope you can be able to zoom in and see. This is just a snapshot of the status of the countries that ECA is supporting in developing the AfCFTA implementation strategies, and also the status. You will see in the first column, there's the countries that have already validated the AfCFTA strategies. And in the second column, you will see countries that are at different levels of developing the strategies, either at inception or stakeholder consultation or the drafting stage. Now, my call and in conclusion is that we will see that there are various opportunities for CAWI and OWIT members to engage with the national policy processes, and I have mentioned these. So it's in the development of the strategies and the implementation of the strategies, and in the establishment or engagement with national AfCFTA committees. So going back to this slide, my question to the members of OWIT and CAWI here, and other businesses that have joined us from other countries, is at which stage is your respective country in terms of developing the AfCFTA national strategy? Do you know who the focal point for the development of the AfCFTA strategy is in your respective country? Remember, I mentioned that this typically is the Ministry of Trade, but who in the Ministry of Trade is responsible for this? And finally, how engaged are you or your organization in the AfCFTA policy making process? This brings an end to my presentation, and I'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nadira and Judith. It had been very enlightening. So we have taken much of our time. We really have gone 10 minutes beyond our schedule. So probably can we allow 10 more minutes for questions and answers? We cannot be able to respond to all questions. But Chinge from OWIT Zimbabwe, President of OWIT Zimbabwe, can you take us for about 10 minutes maximum. So some of the very relevant questions, we are sure that our speakers will respond to all the questions raised, and we will make sure that we send our meeting proceedings to all participants. So over to you, Chinge, manage the 10 minutes, then we'll get back to us.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me, everyone? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Can hear you.
Okay. At this point, I want to first of all to thank you, Center for Accelerated Women Economic Empowerment, for putting together this webinar. And I want to thank you all panelists who have actually given us a detailed presentation of the AfCFTA. And I'm sure most of us now have quite a clear overview after the eloquent presentation by Nadira, a high-level presentation of the AfCFTA. Briefly, my name is Jengin Ndlovu. I am the president of OWIT Zimbabwe. And without maybe wasting much of our time, I will run into the questions. And after that, I'll briefly summarize our takeaways from the presenters. The first question actually goes to Nadia, and it's about what's there to understand about the AfCFTA. What are the important benefits to understand about the AfCFTA? Nadia.
Thanks.
Go ahead, Nadia.
Yeah. So I think I spoke to a lot of what those, I'm just going to have my video off. I'm having some bandwidth challenges, but I think I spoke to a lot of the critical issues to understand, particularly insofar as they relate to the non-tariff barrier mechanism that should be utilized, the importance of defining a gender-responsive trade facilitation agenda. But I think the most important thing to understand is that the benefits of the AfCFTA agreement for everyone, and including for women entrepreneurs, are not going to be automatic. And I know that I reiterated this throughout my presentation, but it's very important for you to understand that this is a continental agreement, but implementation, as Judith led us through, is going to be at the national level. So the question of how we're going to input into gender responsive policies and programs and targeted complementary measures to support this trade agenda under the AfCFTA is critical. And it's particularly critical to be able to identify the opportunities that some of you alluded to, because the AfCFTA implementation start of trade from the 1st of January is not going to miraculously highlight what those opportunities are. You know, there's going to be a need for some sectoral analysis to be undertaken. There's going to be a need for a partnership to be able to establish a trade information portal to identify what these new markets could be. There's going to be a need for more conversations for you to have with your business associations and with other partners. So there's not just a once-off quick fix to AfCFTA implementation. We're in it for the long haul. There's strong collaboration that's required. There's strong partnerships that's required in order for us to be able to address the barriers that, of course, you spoke to and that you experienced to enable you to benefit from the new opportunities. But in saying that, it's also important for you to be able to identify what these new export opportunities are within the context of the AfCFTA. And for that, you need to engage in those conversations with your business associations, with your governments, to participate and to contribute to the sectoral analysis and to various other interventions or initiatives like a trade information portal that could be another new innovation under the AfCFTA that will be able to help you identify what these regional markets are and where you can indeed export to. Thank you.
Oh, Thank you, Nadira. We also realized that amongst our panelists, we've got TFO Canada. And this question will go to TFO Canada, is to you, Mary. That the question is, how can we ensure that businesses register on the TFO Canada platform? The question is from Grace Kimeu.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I wanted to just highlight, especially related to one of the challenges that a guest had mentioned, as well as Carolyn, about access to market information. So this is one of TFO Canada's areas of expertise. We have a lot of information specifically on entering the Canadian market and sector-specific information. So it really helps to address some of those information gaps about what does the buyer want, what are the pricing systems, can I be competitive, what are the market entry regulations. So all of that information is available for free on the TFO Canada website, pertaining to the Canadian market and specific sectors. And you can register your business on our foreign buyer supplier database, and you can upload your product and service offerings on the TFO Canada database, where your products can be viewed by Canadian buyers and other buyers. So we encourage all of you to visit our website, and I will put the TFO Canada link in the chat box.
Oh, thank you, Mary. I think maybe you okay, if you said you're going to share with us the link to the TFO Canada website, that would be great, so that our participants can actually maybe straight away get onto it and register on that platform. This question is for Nadira. It says it's from Patricia. It says, have you seen effective models of collaboration among women-owned SMEs in Africa with large contacts from international and multinational companies?
You know, Patricia, I have to say personally, no, because my work is looking more, has more of a research and a policy analysis focus on gender and linkages with the AfCFTA. But I definitely agree that more successful cases need to be identified, particularly as it relates to partnerships to be developed with larger multinationals and women-owned SMEs, and specifically for these multinationals to be able to assist and to support women-owned SMEs reach regional markets by maybe being part of the supply chain of these companies, as well as providing support for women-owned SMEs for developing their businesses. So as far as I know of effective models for collaboration of women-owned SMEs in the continent to win large contracts from international multinational companies, the answer is no. But in saying that, I do think in the context of the AfCFTA, we need to explore and we need to identify which partnerships have worked, which programs have worked, because there have been successful examples of larger multinationals supporting smaller women-owned SMEs and assisting them in reaching regional markets or international markets by being part of their supply chains. And we need to also understand what can we build on from those success stories. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. That constraints, we cannot answer all the questions. The other, last but not least, maybe I can handle this one, is from Stella Rukuye. She says, how can we ensure that our businesses are compliant and can trade freely across Africa? What is needed? I'm sure this one, briefly, the AfCFTA is all about, it's a free trade agreement, and with the strategies that have been put in place, remember, is that actually we're actually downsizing on the tariffs that are there. Countries are expected to negotiate up to 90% of the tariffs. That on its own should be able to tell us that movement of the goods across the borders should be relatively easier than now. And more so, let us remember that the AfCFTA is premised on the existing regional economic communities. So it is with that in mind that trading within the AfCFTA is actually meant to be very easy, to be relatively easy, since considering that a lot of tariffs would have been be eliminated by the time we start trading. And also, it's also important that this elimination of tariffs is going to take a long time, and countries have been given maybe spaces up to maybe something like 10 to 15 years, depending on the type of country that is actually where you are importing into. Then what comes into scrutiny now is the challenges that have actually been mentioned by President Caroline of OIT Nigeria, that these are sort of questions that most women do have, and they don't know where to have the answers. And maybe it's up to us now as women to be part of these national strategies, part of the national trade committees that actually
Did we lose Shengi?
Yes, I think so.
Shengi, are you there? Maybe her connection is. Oh. I think we need to proceed and finalize. What do you think? Because we already have taken the scheduled time. So, any additional questions or questions that are not answered? I'm sure there are many, so we'll make sure, as I already mentioned, that speakers will respond to that. So we need to close this session. For me, it had been a great session to get the highlights of the AfCFTA. Many thanks, Nadira. You really have gone deep. And Judith, that had been really an opportunity to give us a glimpse and looking forward also to get to know more. As Nadira had been mentioning in her presentation, the AfCFTA does not say much about women. No specific chapter is dedicated to women in trade in the agreement. So the opportunity now, as Judith had been saying, is now contributing to our national policies. Hopefully we are expecting we'll get a chance to incorporate what is missed within the CFTA, the big agreement, so that each one of us can have the chance to incorporate what we want to be incorporated in the national strategies. So we look forward to closely work with you, Nadira and Nadia Judith, because we see that's the powerhouse we have. So hopefully you will be accessible to us all for any troubleshooting. Hopefully, for us, no problem. We are close to us. We can even walk. So even for other countries with the technology permitting, so I hope you will be open to us all in providing us additional guidelines, particularly when we are providing our inputs within our respective national strategies. That will be very helpful. So I sincerely would like to thank you all, the speakers, the participants. Even now, it's really full. This shows that participants are being really interested to go throughout the session, even beyond the scheduled time. So I'm glad, and I would like to thank also the participants. Thank you, Chinge, even though she was cut short because of the internet connection. So we need to close. Last but not least, I would like to thank our sponsors, the SIDA Sweden and Initiative Africa, that have been very instrumental in supporting us in organizing our past platforms, including this one. And now I go over to Mary Heather from TFO Canada to provide us the closing remark. My pleasure, Mary, inviting you. Mary is the program director responsible for TFO program in Africa, which includes planning and implementation, donor communications and partnership management. CAWE is glad continuing its partnership starting 2006. We had been great projects working with TFO Canada, and now we have started partnering again with a new project, Women in Trade project, particularly focusing on women exporters involved in agribusiness. So Mary, we're glad having you to provide us your concluding remarks.
Thank you, Nigest. I think everyone has been thanked appropriately, and I would just like to specifically acknowledge yourself, Nigest, for your leadership, not only in this webinar, but as the Executive Director of CAWE, along with our partners OWIT, who have joined us today to collaborate for this call. I know that one of the important mechanisms is that we need to work together and collaborate and partner. And some of the presenters today from the Africa Trade Policy Center have really encouraged us to share the best practices and make sure that those best practices are incorporated into our national strategies. And so I think unless we continue to have these joint dialogues and continue to talk with each other, we won't be able to benefit from our shared knowledge and experience. So I think this is a great kickoff for this. And it's, I think it's now at least the third or fourth webinar that we've had the privilege of conducting in collaboration with the Africa Trade Policy Unit. So we really value that partnership with our friends and the sharing of their knowledge and experience today. And I just hope that we'll be able to address some of those issues, those practical issues and concerns. And I'll maybe just pick up on one of the things that you mentioned, Nigest, which is the lack of strong regional and national platforms. So I think we have the start of that. We have many strong platforms that are maybe in a few countries, and if we can try to combine those together in a joint effort, I think that that platform can be built. So especially OWIT with their regional presence, their international presence, and others like them, I think we really need to pull those networks together and build on that. So thank you to everyone for your contribution today. It's a pleasure for us to be associated with such knowledgeable women leaders in trade in Africa, and I look forward to the future webinars on this topic and the kickoff of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area from January 1st. So everyone have a great evening.
Thank you, Mary, for the concluding remark. Unfortunate, Chinga was back. Chingy was back. Maybe you were cut short in your internet communications. I have thanked you in your absence. So in any way, we have to finalize. So we have done our concluding remarks. So thank you all speakers again, and all participants. Have a good night. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Nigest and Caroline. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
I'm sorry about the hiccup. There was a power surge. And thank you for the opportunity.
Indeed. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.
How we can do it? No, we have to go. That's it. At least we'll be the last to leave, huh? I'm sorry.
moderation, Madam President.
Tengi, are you speaking? We can't really hear you.
No, we're done. As a
Okay.
host, we have to remain behind. So that's why we're waiting until everyone is gone.